Oops, now they're suddenly speaking English. This episode features the full-length interview we conducted with FZS Monitoring and Evaluation Expert Freja Larsen. To provide you with a bit of context, in our previous regular podcast episode, we examined which data helps Frankfurt Zoo and Frankfurt Zoological Society to measure progress. Zoos always want to better the living conditions of their animals, while Frankfurt Zoological Society protects wilderness and biodiversity. But how do you measure it? What indicators are the organizations looking at, and who is collecting and analyzing the data? Before we dive into the recording, let me quickly address the German-only speakers. Das hier ist die Originalaufnahme des Interviews mit Freja Larsen, die wir in der Folge 47 bereits für euch übersetzt haben. Wer das Gespräch also lieber auf Deutsch hören möchte, der muss einfach im Feed eine Episode nach hinten springen. And now, back to English. You know what it is about, who I talk to and why. So without any fuss, let's just jump into the original recording. My name is Marco Dinter and you're listening to a bonus episode of Hinter dem Zoo geht's weiter. My next guest is Freja Larsen, and with this beautiful name, it's obvious you're from Denmark. Hi, Freja.
Hi, Marco.
But we're very happy to have you here now in the FZS headquarters in Frankfurt. And you are working here as a coordinator for our monitoring and evaluation. I always stumble across that word. Let me say it again. You are working here as our monitoring and evaluation coordinator at FZS. Tricky question, tricky word, and I guess a tricky job. You try to measure how well we are doing at FZS in our projects, how great we are in conservation. How do you do that?
Ooh, what an introduction and what a question. Yes, everything you said is true. That's exactly what I do. And how do I measure our impact in our ecosystems? Well, that really depends on which site we're talking about, because each of our sites have different targets for how they want their ecosystem to look. And the sort of overarching goal of all of our sites is to have an intact ecosystem, or a system with high integrity, you could also say. Yeah.
An intact ecosystem sounds a bit like a Bob Ross picture now to me, like a very beautiful painting of a forest, and I guess there's always a waterfall somewhere. It's super beautiful, super wild. Is that the definition of an intact ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a good question. So an intact ecosystem it means different things depending on where you are in the world, and therefore it means different things for our FZS landscapes. And it's always got something to do with the biodiversity in that landscape, and it's got something to do with the structure, just the physical structure of what kind of habitat do you have, forest or grassland or whatever. And it will have something to do with the amount and level of human impact, but that all differs greatly. And the way that we measure that across our sites is also very different. So my job is to understand how all of our sites are doing it, and then help them and support them when needed to do it the best that we can.
Yeah, we have projects in basically all over the world, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, in Europe even, and it really differs from rainforests to grasslands. We even have like huge wetland areas in Europe, for example, where we are active. You just said biodiversity, and biodiversity is kind of the holy grail of conservation. We all try to achieve that, and it's what we want to preserve. What is biodiversity?
Oh, also a very good question. I would say the scientific community right now is quite close to a consensus of what biodiversity is, but I think the first use of biological diversity was in 1916, if I'm not mistaken. And since then, it's been quite a tumultuous journey to get close to an agreement between everybody who works with nature research. It's been difficult to get to an agreement of what that means. But right now, the consensus is biodiversity is the total variety and variability of life, including the genes and the species and the types of ecosystems that exist on planet Earth. But if you're talking about a localized area, it would be the variability and variety of that area.
So basically everything in between, if I'm looking at the Serengeti right now, which is mostly a savanna in Africa and Tanzania, you would have different ecosystems, like different areas with also like forests and grasslands and ponds or like swamps or whatever. Then different species, of course, and even within the species, different level of genes or something.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one big ecosystem, but there are different types of habitats, as you mentioned, in between. So some forested areas and grassland areas. And you're right, exactly. It's biodiversity would be sort of all of the species from the microorganisms living in the soil or in the vegetation, all the way up to the elephants. And biodiversity is not only about sort of how many of each kind do we have, and even how many types of habitat do we have, but it's also about the abundance of each kind. So when you're talking about variety and variability, it's really important also to know how much is there. So an area or an ecosystem, a hypothetical one with a couple of species in it, let's say, that only have few of each kind, is a lot less diverse than one that has the same number of species but many of each kind. And that's because there's also variability within the species, sort of genetic variability and what we call sort of morphological variability. So just like there's a difference between you and me.
We do look different, for sure.
Only slightly.
But if we want to conserve biodiversity, we should somehow be able to measure what we're doing, right? So how can I measure biodiversity?
Yeah, biodiversity, it's tough to measure biodiversity. And a lot of the time people will measure an aspect of biodiversity rather than the total biodiversity of an area. So if you're interested in mammal diversity, you might do a transect through an area. So and the same with birds and sort of big, larger organisms, basically, or even vegetation. So in the rainforest, you might walk a transect, well, as far as you can get, I guess, without running into too dense vegetation. But you might walk a transect through and count the number of different types of birds that you see. That would be one way to measure the bird biodiversity of an area. But for vegetation, you might also do sort of sampling plots where you have random points inside the area where you go and count the species and the abundance of each kind in plots. For insects, you might put up insect traps and then sort of identify and count the number that you catch over a certain period of time. It gets more and more difficult as things get smaller and smaller, obviously. So for microorganisms, you can have a bit of a tough time describing all of the bacteria and the fungi.
Sounds like a lot of effort, a lot of costs, a lot of time needed. Can we achieve that in our FZS projects to measure everything?
No, I don't think anyone really achieves measuring everything anywhere. But there are a couple of things that you can do as alternatives. You can, for example, select particular species in your ecosystem that you have evidence for being very good indicators of the general health and intactness of the food web, of the ecological network of the system. And then you can monitor them. and count them. So if over time their population is stable and thriving and their distribution in the landscape is good, that could be an indicator that the system as a whole is doing well. That indicator species will vary absolutely with what site you're looking at. So it will be totally different even between habitats inside the same system. So if you've got a river, you obviously want sort of an aquatic organism as an indicator species. And right next to it, you might, as you say, have a grassland savanna, and you'll want a different indicator species.
Can you give me examples of those indicator species from our projects? What are we measuring or monitoring in certain project areas?
Well, the giant otter, for example, is a good indicator species in Peru, because it's an apex predator, and how healthy their population is gives you a good indication of the availability of their prey species and the availability of habitat for them to live in. So, yeah. So
there would be Manu National Park, and in Africa, giant otters does not exist. So I guess we're counting rhinos, for example, or elephants.
Yeah. Although I would say, rhinos, they're a good indicator species for certain things, but because rhinos obviously are under a great threat from humans directly through poaching, monitoring the rhino is also, and in some cases can be mostly an exercise in monitoring how well we are mitigating against a very specific threat. So the rhino numbers in a park or a landscape in Africa might be more of a reflection of how well you're managing the area and protecting the rhinos against poaching, and not necessarily, it could also be depending on your site and depending on your other indicator species that you've selected. But alone, the rhinos wouldn't tell you about the health of the whole ecosystem and the rivers within that ecosystem, the lakes, the soil.
Health of an ecosystem sounds like a perfect ecosystem. Is there even something like a state where we want to be? Like, is there something where we say, this is how we want our ecosystem to look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what you're sort of asking there is, what is our ideal target, sort of where we want the ecosystems to be and to stay that way forever. And a lot of the time, the way people think about this is, how far back do we want to go in history to look at the ideal state of the ecosystem, and sort of just working our way back. If we go a couple of decades back, in Africa, for example, many elephant populations were completely decimated, and as a result, the big impact that they normally have in an ecosystem was severely reduced, and the landscape changed massively as a result. So you wouldn't want to base your idea of a perfect ecosystem on an ecosystem that was very greatly affected by this human phenomenon of poaching. And if you go a little bit further back, then you end up, in sort of the wars, the world wars, and then you go further back and you're in the Industrial Revolution, the onset of colonialism. There's been so many changes, and the further you go back, the more you realize that ecosystems have always changed as a result of not always, but for many thousands of years have changed as a result of humans. And we're actually quite far away, very far away from systems ever being without any human impact. So the question of what is the perfect ecosystem for each place is not only very difficult to answer, but even if we did know this is exactly where we want the ecosystem to be and what we want it to look like, we would have a difficult time even knowing what the ecosystem looked like 500 years ago, because we don't have any data for that. So it's a good question, and I think this is done differently in each site. And right now, our mission is really just to protect what's already there. FZS projects around the world are already very intact, and that's also how we initially select sort of where we can invest and where we can sort of deploy our skills as a conservation organization the best is really protecting what's already there. So we're not necessarily trying to return ecosystems to another state.
But ecosystems can change in either way, I guess. And that's not necessarily a problem. It's more in like a neutral process. Is this indefinite in each way, or are they points of no return where something really is different from now on and we are not able to restore it?
Yeah, just as you say, ecosystems change all the time as a result of climate and variations in populations of species. There might be droughts that mean that certain species struggle and their numbers really decline, and then other species that were originally their competitors have an increase in their populations. So these fluctuations are always going to happen, and ecosystems never stay exactly the same from year to year. But when there is a great disruption of some kind, whether that's a climatic one or an anthropogenic one, some ecosystems can sort of be pushed beyond sort of what you might call a point of no return, where it completely changes so much that it is in a different stable state, is one way that you can describe it. And sort of past that tipping point, it becomes very, very difficult and in some cases impossible to manage the ecosystem or to push it into the state that it was in before.
And we already heard about those tipping points in episode 36 when we talked about the World Biodiversity Conference in Montreal. Once reached, there's no going back, and that might even be a big problem for us humans because we are just depending on some systems being in a certain state. You already said a bit about how we can monitor those ecosystems, how we can measure things. We can do census, we can count animals in quotation marks because it's a bit more than that. To me, it sounds very expensive and also time demanding to do all this research on, like you said, there's basically everything from bacteria to plants to elephants being part of biodiversity. So how can you do that cost-wise?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Sort of transects and doing transects and vegetation plots is it's very expensive, and it's also a bit risky. I was once charged by a leopard doing vegetation surveys in South Africa. Actually, it's quite a scary thing.
I see 2 arms and 2 legs, so he did not eat you. How did you even realize you got charged by a leopard? Did you see it?
No, I was I was walking back from doing a sampling plot back to the vehicle, and it was myself and a ranger. Luckily, there was a ranger with me, unarmed, but at least another person. And at the time, it was very, very dry, and all of these sort of drainage ditches that in the wet season, they carry water through the park. At the time were dry, so you had to sort of cross them, and they're quite deep, so you kind of go down and then you sort of get some momentum and run up the other side. And I did that and ran up the other side, and unfortunately woke up a sleeping leopard that was resting under a bush. Poor thing. And it got a fright and started running towards me, sort of making... I wasn't going to do this noise because I felt like it's just going to be ridiculous, but...
Just do it. Just do it.
It just runs towards you with like a... You can YouTube leopard charging noise. Very loud. And I just sort of froze. Yeah.
And how did you get out of that situation?
Well, the ranger was a couple of steps behind me, and he was still inside the drainage ditch at the time, heard the noise and knew exactly what was going on. So sort of while he's running up the other side of it towards me and the leopard, he sort of grabs a branch. And I think the appearance of him behind me with this huge branch waving and shouting sort of startled the leopard even more. It didn't expect another person. And it turned on its heels and ran the other way.
What a story.
Yeah.
And definitely another reason to say there need to be more comfortable ways to monitor biodiversity.
No, I think actually you can't replace the field methods. I want to really emphasize that. These field methods, the transects, the plots, both for vegetation but also for animal diversity, they're absolutely crucial. Even if you start measuring with more sort of technologically advanced methods, you will always need to ground truth and verify that these numbers that you're getting match what's happening on the ground in your landscape. So you'll never be able to replace these methods, not in my opinion anyway. But comes with some level of excitement, I suppose.
Seems like, but is there more technological methods to do so?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sort of modern genetic methods are really useful for this. So you can take if you're interested in, let's say, soil bacteria or soil microorganisms generally, you can take a soil sample and then in the lab, you can analyze the genetic markers that exist in those samples and then run that past sort of a library or a database of known species and then get a list of species that were present there. This is a really interesting method that's now really sort of exploding across different aspects of biodiversity monitoring, actually. So not only are we using now that for species that are difficult to see and to count, but for just elephants as well, or other species really. So it's called, when you sample soil and water, even animal feces, you would call it environmental DNA methods. So you're looking for DNA from the environment that is present in those samples. And the process is the same. So you take those samples and you put them through the lab and you find out what DNA material was maybe left there by a leopard drinking in the water. They might have left a saliva sample in it, or a chimp wading through to get to the other side would have maybe left some hair. Even if you're sampling animal feces, you would find traces of what they've been eating. So you can use it to even construct these food webs and ecological networks of who is eating what and where. So these eDNA methods are now being used to even get an idea of the diversity of everything from the tiniest of organisms to the biggest ones. And it's a huge advance, really, and it's still quite expensive and difficult to implement. And, it's only just coming up. Well, it's been around for a while, but now we're thinking about using it more to measure our biodiversity.
Why do we even measure the biodiversity in our projects? Could we not just go there, protect all the rhinos and say, okay, this is now a safe species and a safe landscape when there's enough rhinos?
We could. Then we would have a very different aim for the project. Then it would be sort of a very single species aim. But as an organization, really our target and our goal is to protect wilderness and biodiversity as a whole. So intact ecosystems with all of the different species and functional groups that includes. And if we just measured our success based on one species, like a rhino, technically we could say, we've achieved our impact even if we had just a rhino sort of breeding facility. And that's not what we want. We want to make sure that what we're measuring and what we are able to show the people who are invested in FZS in one way or another is that we are actually protecting not just one species but many, and we're protecting the intactness of that whole space.
And you've just been in Zambia and Zimbabwe, where we also have rhinos, for example, in Zambia. How can you... What did you do there? What is your job there?
So my job when I go to the project sites at the moment is really a learning job. Much of the time I spend with the people who collect data and who work with the data every day, the people who use it for analyses. And that's within the different departments of ecological monitoring or community outreach work, all those sorts of things. And so when I go, I try to meet with as many people as possible and ask them a ton of questions about how they collect their data, if they're happy with their systems, how they analyze it, if they want to analyze it differently in the future, what kinds of challenges they have. And through that work, I try to get a very sort of in-depth picture of how each of FZS's projects are achieving their conservation goals for their landscape. And what I'm then building is a bit of a, what do you want to call it? Maybe you could call it a bit of a template of great lessons learned and fantastic ways to do things that we can use sort of for cross-project learning. If one project wants to do something that's already happening elsewhere, then you can learn from each other and build that capacity across. So I'm doing that, and then I'm also supporting, asking them, how do you want to use this data in the future, and how can we use it to better demonstrate the impact that we have. And that maybe sounds a bit abstract, but what I want to say is a lot of the time you can combine different types of data and analyze sort of big data sets that have been collected over long periods of time to really get an understanding of the trends that are happening in your landscape and how you might have contributed to the positive trends or even the negative ones if you've made mistakes in management. You never know. So my goal is also to help these analyses along for us to be able to learn from the work that we've done and to demonstrate our impact.
So you're rather looking at changes and trends than at like one state in time and then never again, basically.
Exactly. It's to try and really make sure that we have these long-term monitoring plans in place.
And how do you select what you're looking at? We just talked about rhinos. I can count rhinos, but I would count a lot of rhinos on a rhino farm. How do you select the species you're looking at to see what you want to see?
That's a very good question, and it varies a lot from project to project. So as the coordinator of monitoring and evaluation, it's not sort of up to me to decide what we measure. That's very much in the hands of the projects and all of the people who are running the projects on the ground. So they say, this ecosystem is functioning like this and this, and these are the things that we want to monitor over time. But where I can add additional value is to sort of, if they have aspirations to do things differently or to engage with new methods, I can be that person who connects them with different opportunities and sort of is a bit of a lot of the time, things are maybe difficult to coordinate from a field site because everybody is extremely busy and has so much to do, keeping things running and making sure that everything that has to happen is happening. And so I can be that person that's able to take a bit of a step back and engage with the research community, with the academic community, and with service providers and with new technologies, and sort of bring those to the projects to say, is this something you're interested in? And if it is, I can be someone who can support the implementation of that.
So a new technology would be eDNA, for example. Is there other things which come to your head right now? Well, I just want to say that actually one of our projects is already doing eDNA work, and it was not me who initiated it, so I want the credit to go to them, the people working in Zumbu National Park, and it's very exciting. We don't have the first results yet, but I'm just so excited to see what they get out of their sample, so just wanted to put credit where credit is due. But another initiative to do with sort of conservation technology is remote sensing, and how we can use remote sensing to answer questions about the integrity and the intactness of our landscapes. So
right now I'm really interested in trying to find a way where we can combine sort of the rise in machine learning and AI with remote sensing satellite imagery, basically. Combine the two and then get these incredible regularly updated maps of our systems to get an understanding of how the land cover is changing and how it's changed over time. And hopefully this can have some uses both as a management tool on the ground, but also as a sort of impact evaluation tool for us to understand how the systems are changing over time.
And how do you do that? Like, do you go on Google Earth and look how your national park is looking like, or?
Kind of. I mean, that's the first step.
Oh, really?
So Google Earth Engine is an incredibly powerful and freely available tool to do exactly that, actually. But there are other options too. There are quite a lot of companies out there that have started to sort of create these bespoke solutions for organizations like ourselves, where they write the algorithms and they apply sort of that technical and specialized knowledge to the satellite imagery that's relevant for us, and then they can do the processing and the analysis and even present it to us in a very digestible format for us to use. So that's also an option. At the moment, it's still in that development stage for me. Part of these site visits is actually also presenting these kinds of ideas to the projects and say, we can do it this way and we could do it that way. Which one would be more useful to you? Which one would you be the most interested in? And then getting that feedback and taking that back with me here to Frankfurt, and then collating it all and making some decisions based on that feedback, basically. So we're still figuring out what will be the best solution. But I mean, I can only recommend Google Earth Engine. It's very cool. You can do lots of very fun stuff.
But it sounds like there's no one approach for every project we have, but we need to be very flexible in all our approaches.
Absolutely. Our projects are so diverse. I mean, we've spoken quite a bit about some of our projects in Africa today. That's maybe also because I've visited the African projects very recently. But obviously, we've got projects in South America, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and each of those projects will need to have specific algorithms for what they want to detect in their landscape. So yes, it would have to be very bespoke.
Sounds like a super interesting job. Thank you for the insights, Freja.
No problem.